Let's talk about recoveries here in this video. I want to bring up three different recovery sections that you'll see in ProMax. So we'll talk about column recoveries, and then flow sheet recoveries, and then also user-defined recoveries. And so to begin with, we're looking here at a GSP turbo expander plant. We have our demethanizer tower, and we want to know how much C2 and C3 we're able to recover here in our liquids product. And so to do that, I'm just going to open up the tower itself, and here on the Process Data tab, underneath this Recoveries section, we'll see our recoveries listed here. And so what these column recoveries are doing is it's simply just looking at all of the inlet streams into that column, adding up how much of each component we have coming in, and then seeing how much of each component goes to each of our outlet streams. And so stream 19 is our overhead gas, where most of our C1 is recovered. And then we can see our liquid here has 93.2% of the C2 is recovered, and 99.5% of the C3 is recovered. And so these column recoveries are really useful if you're trying to analyze the performance of a particular column. And we can see that's very useful in this case. Now, one case, or one thing to look out for, is if you ever have a column that has an inlet stream that's recycled material, then that's something that can throw these recoveries off. And it's easiest to explain if I just illustrate that. I'm going to come to the second page, which is now an RSV. And so very similar, but in this case we have some recycled material that we're splitting off and then sending back to our column. And so what that means in this case is we actually have more material going into the column than we originally had in our feed stream, since this stream 29 that's going into our column is just recycled material in this case. And so what happens if I open up the column, now we're looking at this new demethanizer, you'll see that this is reporting 95.67% C2 recovery. But the C2 recovery on the flow sheet is 96.3%, and we'll talk about where that number comes from shortly. And so these numbers aren't agreeing with each other, and the issue is we don't really want to just look at what's coming into the column. We want to look at the feed stream itself, so how much C2 and C3 we actually have in this process, and compare that to our outlet stream. But inside the column, it's just looking at our inlets, which happen to be more than our feed stream in this case. And so that isn't exactly the comparison that we're looking for. Now, ProMax will also generate flow sheet recoveries for us. And so there is a place that we can find this 96.3% that we want. If I come over here to my tree on the left of my project viewer and close everything up, you'll see that there's a recoveries section. If I open that, there's going to be different types of recoveries created for each flow sheet. And we're just going to focus on the recoveries item here. And so my RSV recoveries is the recoveries for that flow sheet. If I double click on that, what these recoveries are doing is they just look at all of the inlets onto a flow sheet, which in this case is just our one feed that goes towards our tower. So it looks at all of our inlets as a reference, and then looks at all the outlets on that page and the recoveries in each. And so in this case, we can see that compared to the feed, we're recovering 96.3% of our C2 out our liquid stream. Okay, and so these flow sheet recoveries are also very useful, and again, they just look at all of the feeds on that page compared to each of the outlets. Okay. And so that's also very useful, but there are situations where you might want something a little bit different than these defaults, and so you do have the ability to create your own recoveries as well. So let me illustrate a case where that would be useful. On the third page here, we have a sulfur recovery unit, and so the goal here is that we have some acid gas containing H2S. We're converting that into elemental sulfur, and then recovering as much of that sulfur as we can in each of these condensers. And so we have liquid sulfur coming off that's recovered, and then we'll have some sulfur left over in our tail gas here, which is not recovered, and that's going to go on to further processing. Now if I go back to my project viewer, there is a SRU page recoveries, and if I click on that, we'll see that it does have each of the outlets listed, with their recovery, and these recoveries are currently on an atomic basis, and I'll show you how to create those in a minute as well. But we can see that from our first drain we have 54%, the next drain we get another 26.9% recovered, and then about 10.5% recovered. But this is also including our tail gas, where 8% of our sulfur is not recovered, giving us a total of 100%. And so these flow sheet recoveries always add up to 100%. But in this case, we really just want to add these first 3 recoveries together. Obviously, you could do that by hand, but it would be nice to just have those generated by ProMax. And so we'd like to create our own recovery where we ignore the tail gas and just see how much is recovered in these 3 drains. To create your own recovery, I'll just come over here to the recovery section in the project viewer and right-click and choose to add a new recovery. I can name that recovery whatever I like, so I'm just going to call this my Sulfur Recovery. And when creating a recovery, the very first thing it's going to ask you for is a reference stream. And so you can see a reference stream is selected. I need to choose and tell ProMax which stream to reference when we're defining recoveries. And so we want to reference the stream that we're hoping to recover sulfur from, which in this case is just our acid gas coming onto the page. So I'm going to come down to my flow sheet filter, choose the sulfur recovery page, and the only inlet, so my only reference stream with sulfur in it, is going to be my acid gas. And so I'm going to select that and push that over. That's my reference stream, so my initial sulfur is all found there. Then below references I can come to recovery streams, and that's where I'm going to choose which streams I count as a recovery stream. So that's going to be my 3 drains. I'll switch my filter here to the SRU page again, and I can see sulfur drain. The first one is here. I can double click and double click on the other 2 as well, and then I'm not going to choose the tail gas because that's not a recovery stream, even though it is an outlet stream. So with my reference stream selected and my recovery streams selected, I can now come down to components, and here we can choose which components we want to look at. And so in this case we only want the sulfur components really, but we can leave them all selected, and it's just going to provide us with additional information that maybe we don't need, but it's just additional information. But you could come through and just choose the specific components you're looking at. And then it's important to note for sulfur recovery that we actually want to know what our recovery is on an atomic basis. And so our sulfur came in as H2S. We're not trying to recover H2S, that component. We're just trying to recover the sulfur elements, or sulfur atoms themselves. And so I'm going to choose this atomic basis checkbox. And so it's reported now as just pure elemental sulfur. When I do that and come to the results, we'll see a very similar table to what we saw earlier. But now you'll notice the tail gas is not reported. And so this is just summing up the recovery from those 3 recovery streams that we have, giving us 91.9% recovery. And so that's an example of a user-created recovery and how you could use that to your benefit. Now the last thing I'll show you really quick is how to report this value on your flow sheet. We're going to do that using short monikers, and unfortunately you can't right-click and choose to add to short moniker list because all this information comes in kind of table form in an array. And so how we're going to make a short moniker is by coming up to this moniker builder button. And when I click on that, that brings up my moniker tree, and I can just go find that recovery. So under recoveries, the one named Sulfur Recovery, looking at its properties, and on this summary table column, I want my S1 recovery. So I'll highlight that, name it what I want it to say on my flow sheet. So Sulfur Recovery, and choose to add that moniker. Now I can close this window and go back to my flow sheet, and when I add a property table, I'm going to double click on that, come down to the moniker option, and I'll see that Sulfur Recovery variable available right there. Okay, you can change it to look however you want, and when we click OK, we'll see that recovery now shown on our flow sheet. And so that's a quick explanation of the different recoveries available here in ProMax.